Every year from all over North America, there's accounts and reports of people encountering these truly dangerous and feral people in the various parks and various forest systems. Today I'm going to share with you two stories of people who have encountered these feral people, one in the Great Smoky Mountains and one on the Pacific Crest Trail. But before we get into their stories, if you've had an encounter or know a story that you would like to have shared on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And the next time you go venturing off into the woods, don't forget to grab that subscribe button for protection so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounters. In 2005, John was 19 years old. He was living in Cincinnati. John was a bit of a loner. He did not really have a lot of friends. He did not go out to parties. He did not do a lot of stuff that typical 19-year-olds would do. So he spent majority of his free time playing a massively multiplayer online game called World of Warcraft. He was absolutely obsessed with this game, and that's pretty much all he did with his spare time. Through playing this game, he ended up meeting a girl that was roughly the same age as him. Her name was Michelle, and she lived in Augusta, Georgia. These two quickly hit it off. They spent pretty much every waking minute either talking in the game, talking on Facebook, calling each other up on the phone, and they started to develop a really strong bond, even though they had never met each other. But that October, the two of them, they had had enough. They decided they had to meet in person. So Jonathan offered to drive from Cincinnati down to Augusta because Michelle did not have a driver's license. And both of them, they did not have a lot of money, so they could not afford a plane ticket to go see each other. So they made a plan that Jonathan would come down, he would spend a week at Michelle's, then he would make his way back home. He decided he was going to leave on a Wednesday after work. That way he would not be dealing with weekend traffic if he left on the Friday. So he booked a week off work. That Wednesday, he got home, he loaded his car, and he started making the drive down to Augusta. He had a couple of stops to make along the way. He stopped and got some food, he stopped and got some gas, and that night around 10:30, he was making his way down Highway 441 through the Great Smoky Mountains. Jonathan had been to the Great Smoky Mountains as a kid, camping with his parents, but he had never driven through them by himself, especially not at night. And he really did not do a lot of night driving on the highway in general. So as he made his way down 441, he was really taking it slow, really paying attention for any wildlife that might come running across the road, paying attention to other vehicles coming his way. He really did not want to get into an accident or have any issues whatsoever. There was absolutely no cell service where he was, so he was really being extra cautious on this drive. At one point, he was coming down the highway made a turn to the right, and as he made his way around this corner, watching up ahead in his headlights, he spotted something on the right-hand side of the road, right up against the bush line. He kind of turned his eyes, looked in that direction as the car made its way around the turn, and he noticed that this was a little girl just standing right up against the bush line right on the side of the highway. He instantly found that very concerning and very odd that there would be a little girl out basically in the middle of nowhere at that time of night. As he got closer, he noticed that this little girl appeared to be about 9 years old. She was wearing a gray tattered dress, and she was staring directly at his vehicle as he made his way towards her. When he got a little bit closer, he slowed down, looked directly at her to get a good look at her, and he just kept driving. He ended up driving about 200 yards past her. He pulled over to the side of the road. Then he sat there for a minute, kind of debating what he should do next. He did find it incredibly odd and very concerning that this little girl was in the middle of nowhere on the side of the road, but at the same time, he did not pass any vehicles that were broken down. He did not see any vehicles that had veered off the road. So he really did not know what to do. But after a couple of moments, he decided he had to go back to help this little girl. He cannot just leave a 9-year-old girl on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere at night. So he turned his vehicle around, started driving back towards where he had spotted this little girl. When he got to where she had been standing, he could see her standing now a little bit into the bush line. So he pulled his car over to the side of the road, he put it in park, rolled down his window, then he yelled out to this little girl to see if she needed help. She did not respond, but as soon as he yelled out to her, she kind of took a couple of steps backwards and disappeared into the trees. Jonathan, at this point, he opened up his center console, he grabbed a flashlight, opened his door, got out, and he started making his way across a highway towards that opposing bush line. The entire time as he was walking across the road, he just kept yelling out to her, asking her if she needed help. When he got to the bush line, he took a few steps into the trees, again yelling out, "Do you need help?" He could not hear this girl respond, so he took a couple of more steps into the bush, when all of a sudden he noticed directly in front of him, he could see this little girl kind of just on the outside of his flashlight beam, peeking at him from behind a tree. So again, he yelled out to her, he said, "Do you need help? I'm here to help if you need help." And this little girl just started hysterically laughing. Jonathan was a little bit taken back by her response, just because that was not what he was expecting at all. So again, he said, "Do you need help?" And this little girl started running parallel to the highway through the trees, and she would periodically stop behind other trees and just peek back, look towards him, and start laughing again. At this point, Jonathan's trying to figure out, like, what's going on here. Like, this kid's in the middle of nowhere. I'm offering help, and she's just laughing at me and running through the bush like it's a game. So again, he ended up yelling out, "Do you need help?" This little girl at that point started making her way towards him, but again, staying behind each tree as she made his way towards him. And every time she would get behind a tree, she would peek out, look at him, and start laughing. Jonathan at this point was feeling a little bit uneasy. Like, even though this was a kid, this was not typical behavior, even for a child, especially in this situation. This child absolutely had no fear of being out in the bush at night, and especially with a stranger calling to her, to be laughing at him like that. Jonathan at this point, he took a couple of steps back, focused on this little girl who again was just staring directly at him, hysterically laughing. Jonathan decided, you know what, I'm just going to tell her if she does not need help, I'm going to leave. You know, maybe that will make her realize that this is not a game, and maybe she'll come with me, or at least start to talk so I can find out what's going on. So he took a couple more steps back, yelled out to her, "If you don't need help, I'm going to leave." And as soon as he yelled that out to this little girl, she broke her gaze on him, she turned, looked behind her into the darkness. Jonathan found that a little weird at the time, so he kind of stopped moving backwards, looking towards this little girl. Now he's looking at the back of her head, and he can see that she's staring deeper into the woods. A couple of seconds later, all of a sudden he hears what sounded like really loud mumbling coming from in the darkness, and then he heard this little girl respond back to this mumbling with very similar mumbling, but obviously in a child's voice. Jonathan at this point now is completely freaking out because he has no idea who this little girl's talking to. He has no idea if they're a threat. So he just yells out, "Okay, I'm leaving," turns around, starts running back to his car, which was not too far away. It was only about 20 yards. When he got to his car, he opened the door, jumped in, closed it, turned and looked back across the road, and he could see movement in the darkness. So at this point, he lifted up his flashlight, shone it into the bush, and he saw that little girl with this man that had this absolutely long, scraggly beard. He was wearing what almost looked like a gray robe, like a long gray robe that was very similar in color to this little girl's dress. And in his right hand, he was holding this really thick, big, long branch that at the very top of it looked like it had been carved into a spear with multiple little prongs coming off the top. Jonathan at this point was like, "Okay, I'm out of here." He put the car in drive and he just took off. Now his car was facing north on 441 and he had to go south to get to Michelle's. So after driving for about a mile, he stopped right in the middle of the road, and debated what he should do next. He really wanted to go meet Michelle, but he did not want to have to drive back past that area again. So ultimately, he ended up deciding he would just head home, contact Michelle, save up some money, and in a few weeks he would fly down to go see her because he did not want to have to drive that section of highway ever again. He has no doubt that if he would have walked further into the bush after this little girl, that something incredibly bad would have happened to him. He doesn't know what, but he said that situation was the most terrifying experience of his entire life. In August of 2010, Erin was 25 years old. She had just released from the U.S. military, where she had spent several years as a combat medic in the U.S. Army, and she was slated to start a new job, a new career, up in Washington State at a personal care home as a nurse. She had about a month before she had to start this new job, so she decided she was going to try to follow one of her lifelong goals of hiking a portion of the Pacific Crest Trail. The Pacific Crest Trail runs from the Mexico border all the way up to the Canadian border, and it's about 2,650 miles. Now, she would not have enough time in 1 month to hike this entire portion, so she wanted to hike a good portion of the northern side of California, specifically around Mount Shasta. It was an area that she had always wanted to go, but she just never had the time to get up to this area, never had the time to hike in this area. So she thought this would be the perfect opportunity to spend a couple of weeks hiking this trail that she's always wanted to hike and get to see an area of California that she's always wanted to go to. She spent a couple of days looking over trail maps, making sure she knew exactly what kind of terrain she would be facing on this hike, and she also went through all of her kit just to make sure she had everything she would need. What she was bringing with her was a tent hammock, so she'd be able to set it up between two trees. She'd be up off the ground, away from snakes. It had a rain cover, so she'd be nice and dry, nice and comfortable. She had her camp stove, her water purification tablets. She had a whole bunch of MREs that she would be using as her main food source. And she was also bringing along her Smith & Wesson 45. She never left home without her sidearm. Now, she was not going to be hiking with it on her hip or on her waist. She was just going to keep it in her pack. She figured she would not need it, but it just made her feel better knowing that she had it just in case. So when the time came, she loaded up her pack. She got a friend of hers to drive her to a trailhead. She kind of waved off to her friend, and she started making her way down the trail. The first week of Erin's hike went absolutely great. She was completely enjoying herself. She was just taking in just the breathtaking scenery of this area. She was really not having too much trouble with the hike itself. Again, she was a combat medic. She had just released from the U.S. Army. She had done a tour over in Afghanistan the year before. So this type of hike was really not that difficult for her. So it was really relaxing for her as she made her way down the trail, just being in complete solitude. She would occasionally come across another hiker. She would say hello, she would wave, but that was really the extent of her human interaction for the first 7 days of this hike. The 8th night, Erin was not at one of the shelters, so she did what she did every other night along her hike if she was not at a shelter. And she moved off the trail about 10-15 yards, strung up her hammock, got out her camp stove, heated up some water to heat up her MREs, had some food, then she climbed into her hammock and she settled in for the night. The next morning she woke up, she started gathering up all of her stuff, and she noticed that her camp stove was just gone. So she looked around, trying to figure out what happened to this thing, and her first thought was, maybe a small animal came, knocked it over, maybe it pulled it into the bush. So she spent about 20 minutes looking for her stove. Ultimately, she did not end up finding it, but she was like, okay, well, as much as this sucks, I could still eat MREs cold. It's not like I haven't done it before. So she packed everything up and she continued down the trail. Throughout the day, as she made her way down the trail, she would periodically think about her camp stove and just how truly bizarre it was that it just went missing without a trace, and how much it sucked that now she wouldn't be able to boil water, which meant she couldn't have coffee, and it really put a damper on her spirits. That evening, as it started to get dark, she knew she was nowhere near shelter. So again, that night, she moved about 10, 15 yards off the trail. She set up her hammock, had a cold MRE, climbed into the hammock for the night. And that night, at around 3:30 in the morning, she was awoken by the sound of twigs snapping and just the rustling of leaves moving towards her hammock. Now, because she was a combat veteran, she had done that tour over in Afghanistan the year before, and she had spent so much time in the military, she really developed the skill set of being able to wake up really easily no matter how deep of a sleep she was in. So as soon as she heard that cracking, she was instantly awake and fully alert. She heard the cracking moving closer towards her hammock, and all of a sudden she felt something bump up against her side and the hammock starting to sway. At this point, she's thinking that some animal is just coming to her camp, bumped up against her hammock. So she reaches over, she grabs her .45, just in case she has to defend herself against whatever animal this was. She's kind of lying there in the hammock. She has her .45 down by her side. She doesn't really want to make too much noise at this point because she has no idea what is outside right now. She doesn't know if she makes noise, if this thing's going to get startled, if it's going to lead to some type of an attack. So she just lies there, kind of hoping in her head that whatever it is just going to go away. A couple seconds later, she feels something push on her again, and this time she recognized that feeling. She recognized the feeling of what was pushing against her was the feeling of two hands pushing up against her side. At this point, her adrenaline shot up and her training kicked in, and as soon as she felt that hammock move away from the hands, she quickly undid the flap, rolled out. As soon as she hit the ground, she had her weapon up with her tactical flashlight on, aiming towards her hammock. Standing right on the other side of the hammock, she could see this tall, large, but yet skinny man wearing this light gray robe with a big cloaked hood. The cloaked hood came down past his eyes up towards where his nose would be, and she could see part of a beard sticking out. She could not see this guy's facial features at all. She had her weapon up, aiming towards him, and she just started screaming at this guy. This guy did not flinch at all. He just stood there, almost like he was in a daze, staring at her. At this point, she stood up, the weapon still up, still ready, aiming towards this guy, and she notices that behind him, she could see three more of these figures about 15 yards away, just standing inside the woods. Her adrenaline at this point was just absolutely through the roof. Her heart was racing and just beating out of her chest. And because screaming at this guy was doing absolutely nothing to trigger a response from him, she took her weapon, aimed it off to the side. She fired a couple of shots into a tree in the hopes that that would send a very clear signal to him that she's not to be messed with. But this man did not react at all to those gunshots. And as a matter of fact, those other three figures started moving closer towards her. At this point, she was having a moral dilemma in her head because she knew she was in danger. And being overseas on a tour, she saw firsthand what people can be capable of. So she knew that she was really in a very potentially dangerous situation right now. And she knew that, she can most likely take all four of these people out and be justified in it, but at the same time, she did not want to have that weighing on her conscience, and she did not want to have to take that measure if she did not absolutely have to. At this point, she fired one more shot again into a tree, and she turned and booked it back towards the trail. She decided that she was just going to run and just keep running for as long as she could to put as much distance between her and these people as possible. She did not care about any of her kit anymore, and she just wanted to get out of there. She ran for probably about a mile down the trail, which was completely exhausting for her, just because the terrain is so uneven, it changes in elevation. And after about an hour, she was just completely worn out. At this point, she decided she was not staying on the trail anymore, and she moved just off the trail. She lied flat on her stomach. She ended up covering herself with a bunch of foliage and a bunch of sticks, kind of camouflaging herself in with the ground. And she just lied there and listened and watched to see if those people were actually following her or not. After about 45 minutes, just out of pure exhaustion and that adrenaline crash, she ended up passing out. She ended up just dozing right off. A couple of hours later, as the sun was coming up, she kind of startled herself awake, realizing that she had actually fallen asleep. And at that point, she was starting to realize as well, like, what just happened actually happened. That was not a dream. She laid there for about a half an hour, again, just watching, listening for any sign of these people. Once she realized that she could not hear them, she could not see them, she got up and she just, again, started running down the trail. She ended up getting to Edna a little bit early, where she ended up calling her friend to come pick her up. To this day, Erin has no idea who these people are or what they wanted, but she truly believes if she did not have her firearm with her that night, that things would have played out completely different, that she would have most likely never been seen again.